Hello, my name is Heidi Kretser, and I work with the Wildlife Conservation Society. I'm also adjunct associate professor at Cornell University's Department of Natural Resources and the Environment. Today, I'm representing the Conservation Social Science Partnership, and I will be leading a training on ethical concepts for research involving people. Feel free to keep a pen and some paper nearby, as I will periodically ask you questions to think about in the context of conducting research with people. What are some of the different ways that we collect data from or about people? Go ahead and think about that for a couple of minutes and maybe write down some of your answers. Feel free to pause the video and you can take a little more time. Some of the methods we can use to collect data from people include interviews, in-person questionnaires, online surveys, focus groups, camera traps, videos, audio recordings, social media data, satellite data. There are a huge variety of ways in which data from or about people can be collected, with or without their knowledge. Because conservation practitioners are often working in remote places conducting research, there may be little oversight on how research is being conducted. What does it mean to be ethical when conducting research in the social sciences? Think about that for a few minutes and write down some thoughts on your paper. Again, if you want to pause the video, feel free to do so. At its simplest, ethics is a system of moral principles. These moral principles affect how people make decisions and lead their lives. Ethics may guide individuals as they think about the following dilemmas: how to live a good life. What are my rights and my responsibilities? What is right? What is wrong? What is good and what is bad? Researchers in any discipline have moral, professional, and increasingly legal obligations to act ethically and with good moral intent. And using ethics to guide research practice is the right thing to do. With regard to legal obligations, for example, in the United States, most research conducted by government, universities, and those funded by these institutions must be approved by an ethics board. In the US and elsewhere, it's a requirement of funders, both for research and increasingly conservation projects, as funders want to ensure their money is invested in activities that will not harm people. This training is to introduce you to the ethical concepts that are important in collecting data from human subjects. It is also to ensure that your research does not pose more than a minimum risk to the people participating in your study. And finally, it is to provide you with the tools you need to plan work that will meet ethical review board requirements. Many organizations, including governments, have an institutional review board or an ethical review board to ensure that you have thought about ethical considerations in the planning and proposed implementation of your work. Why do we have this training? For many years, no research oversight existed, and there are many examples of unethical research practices that had irreversible and terrible impacts on research participants. In one example, African American men in the United States were subjects of a study on the effects of syphilis. They were not given penicillin, even though it was clear it would benefit them, and the risks from untreated syphilis were very, very high. In Nazi Germany during World War II, the Nazis used painful experimentation and horrific research practices on imprisoned humans of non-Aryan descent without their consent. These and many other examples of unethical treatment of human subjects and research that caused great harm to people led to commitments for ethical research by many countries and international bodies. Each country now has its own set of commitments. Given the proliferation of these commitments and the importance of using ethical principles in research involving people, the Conservation Social Science Partnership has created a minimum standards training for practitioners in the field who do not have access to other training opportunities, so that you can bring an ethical lens to your research planning and implementation. Once you have this training, you will be able to prepare your research proposal and submit it for ethics review. An ethics review process is intended to ensure that researchers have adequately addressed ethical considerations in the planning and proposed implementation of their research or activity, and that your work does not pose more than minimum harm to those involved. Fortunately, most conservation research aims to go beyond do no harm by actually providing benefits to people in the medium to long run. To meet the requirements for doing no harm, all researchers must be compliant with ethical standards and regulations governing the research. These standards could be coming from the government, your organization, or the local community. You might be wondering, where do I even begin? The first step is check to see if your organization has an institutional review board, or IRB, or an ethical review board, or an ERB. For example, in the case of my own institution, the Wildlife Conservation Society, all research must be reviewed by WCS's in-house IRB. Next, you must remember that some countries have their own requirements for ethics review. For example, Kenya and Indonesia each have their own requirements. In those cases, researchers must submit applications for 2 or possibly even 3 reviews: your organization's review, the in-country review process, and any required local reviews. This is particularly important if your work involves Indigenous peoples and local communities who are organized and want to understand what kind of research you will be doing in their community, and if they would like to give you permission to do research in your community. You are responsible for knowing the local and national requirements in the country where you are working and making sure that your work complies with those, in addition to complying with your own organization's requirements. Every organization that has an IRB or ERB will have different requirements. However, you will likely be able to meet those requirements by adhering to some of the following steps. First, complete an approved online training, such as the Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative or CITI training on social and behavioral research. Or if your organization does not have an arrangement with an online training company or other specific training requirements, you can simply use this one that you're taking now, because this is a minimum standards training. If you'd like to learn more, then you can pursue some of those online trainings. Second, you complete the application process that your institution has provided for you, or the national government or the local government. You can follow the ethical review process, or you can follow the ethical review process that was developed by the Conservation Social Science Partnership, or ConsoSci. And that can be found at the website consosci.org. Now, let's understand some basic ethical principles. The first is respect for persons. With this concept, individuals should be treated as individuals, and persons with diminished autonomy or diminished ability to make decisions for themselves are entitled to protection. Thus, respect for persons demands that subjects enter into research voluntarily and with adequate information provided to them. The second is beneficence, where persons are treated in an ethical manner, not only by respecting their decisions and protecting them from harm, but also by making efforts to secure their well-being. With this in mind, we must first do no harm in the course of research implementation. Additionally, investigators and their institutions are obliged to give forethought to maximizing benefits and reducing risks that might occur from a project. Finally, justice. This invokes questions about who ought to receive the benefits of the research, who ought to bear the burden, and what is that fair distribution of benefits, or what benefits should be given by this work and to whom. In the past, particularly with medical research, subjects were often unwitting respondents and also poor or in other ways marginalized. When thinking about justice in this context, researchers might consider aspects such as how are you going to recruit your respondents to the study? What impact will the research have on different populations, both respondents and people who are not participating in the study or non-respondents? And who will ultimately benefit from the research? Implementing these principles in research will help maintain integrity, trust, and social goodwill of various publics with and for whom researchers are working. These principles are very important because so much research occurs unobserved, meaning there is significant opportunity for improper conduct to occur. By demonstrating ethical behavior, researchers promote confidence in the research process and in the reliability of the research findings. And in the specific case of research conducted by conservation organizations, upholding these principles will lead to more durable conservation outcomes. Importantly, applying these principles will minimize risk. Minimizing risk is defined as ensuring that the harms or discomforts of participating in the research is not higher than what the individuals could experience in everyday life. In the conservation field, remember that there may be risk if a subject provides information about illegal activities. There also may be risk if they have unacceptable views according to community norms or standards, or if they state opinions that depart from the local community or the government policy of the state. To minimize risk, we adhere to 3 actions: obtaining consent from the respondent to participate in the research, protecting the participants, especially if you are collecting private or sensitive information, and protecting vulnerable populations. Let's now talk about each of these. We'll start with obtaining consent. Take a few minutes to think about and write down what each of the words on the screen mean to you: free, prior, and informed. Feel free, again, to pause the video if you want to take a little bit of time to really think about what these mean. These are the core tenets for obtaining consent. First, you must ensure that you obtain consent with no manipulation of the respondents, and the person gives consent freely as an individual. Before you can ask for consent, you must give each participant the information that they need to understand the study and its implications. That's prior. And finally, informed is that you must provide information, and it must be complete, including all of the component parts of the research and its implication, which we're going to discuss. Free, prior, and informed consent is critical for every researcher to understand and to use when recruiting participants into a study. Before obtaining consent, the researcher must provide details about the study by explaining to the respondent 6 key components: the research objective, or the expected duration and the procedure, plus as well as any special instructions that might need to be followed, any of the potential risks or discomfort that might be encountered from the research or resulting or that might happen to the individual as a result of the research, and any benefits, potential benefits of participation. Additionally, you need to inform them if and how confidentiality of the information that they provide to you will be maintained, and also provide details of someone other than that of the enumerator, maybe that's you, maybe it's somebody you've hired, that they can contact if they have any questions about the research. Usually that's the project PI, or principal investigator. And you need to be very explicit about the fact that participation is voluntary. It is after you are certain of that all of this information has been communicated that the subject has the right to decide whether or not they accept the risks. The IRB, or the Ethical Review Board, does not decide for the subject. They decide for themselves. Just to note, asking for consent extends beyond requesting someone to respond to a survey or participate in a focus group. This also has implications for the study design and the types of data that are being collected, such as photographs or GPS locations or audio recordings, or even the dissemination of the research results that might contain a community's intellectual property rights. You will need to think carefully about the different points in your research that would require asking for consent and from whom, and making it crystal clear what that consent is for. Feel free to pause the video here and write down how you might communicate each of the 6 points in a short introductory paragraph that you would use to explain your work for someone. And those components are, again, objective, risk, benefit, confidentiality, contact, and voluntary. Once you've covered these 6 topics, objective, risks, benefits, confidentiality, contact information, and the voluntary nature of the participation, then you can ask, do you agree to participate in the study? You can only continue with your work if the person says yes. If they say no, say thank you and move on to the next person. Remember to record the number of people that refuse. This will help you get to your response rate. This will help demonstrate that you are respecting people's wishes, and it will also help you to reflect on how willing people were to participate in the research and whether the data is fully representative of your target group, or if there could be some limitations to consider. Additionally, reporting of response rates is always well liked by manuscript reviewers if you are planning to submit your work to a journal. The ethics review will also want to know how you are handling the recording of consent. In some cases, you will need to document with written consent using a form with the participant's name and a signature or fingerprint. Usually, oral consent will be sufficient, but you will be required to indicate in writing or digital form that you heard yes. Rarely will there be a situation in which no documentation of consent is needed, though sometimes inquiries into illegal activities can be given such leeway. Remember, the Ethical Review Board is checking your application to ensure that the approaches will minimize the risk to the respondent. That said, it is only the respondent themselves, not you, not the ethics committee, not a friend standing nearby, who decides whether they want to take on those risks. You must always respect the rights of individuals who refuse unreasonable intrusion into their lives or to control the extent and time and circumstances of obtaining personal information about them. Remember, they are volunteering. Keep in mind that free means no manipulation, no pressure. It's completely voluntary, and your respondent can end their participation at any time with no repercussions. Let's move on to ways to protect participants. What do you think is the difference between anonymity and confidentiality? Take a moment to write that down, what you think that difference might be. And again, if you need to pause the video, feel free to do so here. Anonymity means no identifiable information is collected. With anonymity, you don't collect any identifiable information, so that it's impossible for the data to be linked to a specific individual. It extends beyond names and addresses to photographs, voice recordings, any kind of GPS data, or any data from which an identity can be determined. And in fact, you don't even know the name or the identity of your respondent. Anonymity should be used if there's a risk to the participant by collecting identifiable information, for example, in studies of illegal behaviors, or if the participant requests it. Anonymity is different from confidentiality. With confidentiality, your research data contains identifiable information, such as the name or an email address, or you may know the individuals who are part of the research. In most cases, the methodology must ensure that a respondent's identity and information remains confidential. That is, their responses are never connected to that identifiable data. If you can design a study that maintains anonymity, that's ideal, but most will be able to maintain confidentiality, and you will need to think about how to do that. Pseudonymization of data means replacing any information which could be used to identify an individual with a pseudonym, or in other words, a value which does not allow the individual to be directly identified. You want to ask yourself, what happens if I drop my folder with questionnaire results and the village chief finds it? Will they be able to identify those individuals? If yes, then you likely need a process for removing identifiers and altering the information so that it's not possible to directly identify the individual. Sometimes you might need to store the names of individuals in a separate file from the actual information that they provide. And those two different data sheets may be connected by a number that you assign to each of the respondents. When are each of these appropriate? When is it appropriate? Which situations would you choose to make your research anonymous, confidential, or pseudo-anonymized? This is kind of a trick question because it really depends on the type of information that you're collecting and what you intend to do with that data. So you will need to think about that individually, about how that works in your research study. Often when collecting data, it's necessary to consider that what kind of information you're collecting in order to decide how you're going to handle that data. There's two types that I want to talk about today, and that's private information and sensitive information. Private information might include information about a behavior taking place in a context where the individual would not normally expect to be observed or recorded, or that they would not expect to be made public. This might include something like their medical history or their finances or GPS locations of their favorite fishing spot. If it was made public, it would not likely harm the individual per se, but they might feel a little uncomfortable about it. Sensitive information, on the other hand, is private information, but additionally, it could harm the individual, either because it's illegal behavior or because they could be discriminated against, or it could destroy their reputation. Imagine some people may not want their sexual orientation to be known by other members of their community, or they might not want to have past engagement in illegal behaviors to become known by a future employer. The collection of sensitive information requires even more cautions in terms of protecting the individuals involved. One thing you can do is think about different situations in which you might encounter information and you would need to think about, should I be sharing that information or not? For example, if a prime minister says something on TV, is that private information? Or can we identify and attribute the quote? Another example is, what if a village chief says something at a meeting in the middle of a village? What is that kind of information? And finally, what if you're having a discussion between you and one of your research respondents who happens to be from a low-income family, and they're telling you things about that community? These are the types of questions that you can discuss with other researchers to think about whether you're collecting private information, sensitive information, and how you might want to treat that kind of data that you're taking. Will you need to make it anonymous? Will you keep it in confidence? Or do you need to use some pseudo-anonymization? These are all questions that you will need to decide as a researcher. When thinking about respectful research, you might want to keep some of these points in mind. You want to be able to allow the respondents the ability to indicate where and when they want to provide information. When you're conducting your research, consider who might be able to hear the responses being given. In many contexts, there is simply no such thing as a private space, and it's inappropriate to ask people to leave the family environment in many circumstances. That said, it is especially important to consider when asking women or others who may be vulnerable to some form of retaliation, such as domestic violence. Respondents may also vary their responses depending on who is around or the environment that they're in. Even something like the weather, if it's really cold or if it's a rainy day and you're doing this outside, you might get different responses from a different type of day. So the other thing to consider is that you need to limit the questions that you want to ask to that which is essential to answer your research question. And this can only be determined through very clear planning on what your objectives of your research are and really thinking through the types of questions that you need to ask. What is your researcher's responsibility? Researchers have a duty to ensure that the data collected is only used in a way that it was consented to be used. For example, data on illegal behavior should not be used to sanction participants. Researchers also have a responsibility to think about how they communicate the findings and the potential implications on participants at all levels. For example, if you're collecting information about a whole community, could that create some sort of problem down the road? What if your findings result in a corrupt government deciding to increase surveillance of those individuals? So you need to be careful as you're thinking about where your data is going to go, who is going to see it, how might it be used. And for our last topic of the day, let's shift to vulnerable populations. What groups do you think are considered vulnerable populations? Think about that for a few minutes and write down your responses. And again, feel free to pause the video. All populations contain people who are vulnerable. Some of the ones listed here are specifically defined as vulnerable in the United States and in international standards. There may be others that are not on a list of vulnerable categories of people, but who may be vulnerable in a specific context, like in some of the research settings that you'll be encountering. Vulnerable populations include people who, in certain circumstances, have limited or compromised autonomy. This might include children, mentally handicapped persons, economically or educationally disadvantaged people, or employees or students of the researcher, among others. Many of these groups are particularly sensitive if you are targeting them specifically to ask about their status within the group. Or in the case of pregnant or nursing women or physically disabled, there may be real considerations for biomedical research. So you need to reflect on your context. What is being asked and how will the results affect certain populations? And you should think about whether potential participants should be considered vulnerable. As researchers and conservationists, we should be inclusive of everyone. We are responsible for understanding who may be vulnerable in a particular situation and for figuring out how to include those individuals in a way that addresses the vulnerability and does not place them at risk. When your questions pose minimum risk and some individuals from those categories happen to be part of the recruitment, it's not very serious. It's much less serious. However, you still might need to make some accommodations for individuals in these groups. The fact that someone is vulnerable is not grounds for excluding them from your research. It means you might need to take extra steps to accommodate their needs and facilitate their participation in the research. One example of accommodations that need to be made for a specific group group include research with children. In most places and under most circumstances, children require special consideration as they are considered minors and need consent to participate in research from a parent or a legal guardian. In some places, individuals under the age of 18 are actually the head of households. They may be married with their own children and managing their own affairs. This situation would require special consideration as they are part of the community and you wouldn't want to exclude their voice from your research. In summary, you as researchers have the obligation to minimize risk to the people you are asking questions of by obtaining consent, protecting participants in your study, especially if you are collecting private or sensitive information, and protecting vulnerable populations. This training was designed to emphasize these points and provide clear guidance on how to implement these concepts in the context of doing research. Please remember to have all of your research plans reviewed by an appropriate ethics review committee. For more information about the topics presented in this training, please consult these resources on the Conservation Social Science website, consoci.org. Thank you very much for participating in this training, and thanks a lot for your attention.